The IL-8 is the aviation reward from the Airborne General Battle Pass in early 2024. Let's check it out. Aviation on the Eastern Front of World War II was in a completely different situation than it was on the Western Front or the Pacific Theater. The main focus was on close air support, and fighter cover for the close air support. Emphasis was placed on plans and designs that could be rushed into service quickly, rather than on radical new aircraft that would have taken longer to get into production, or that might have used unproven design elements. To this end, in 1942, the IL-8 was developed as a possible follow-on to the hugely successful IL-2. It used the basic design of the IL-2 as a starting point, but scaled everything up to accommodate a larger engine, a heavier weapon load, and importantly, more fuel. The IL-8's design was superficially similar to the IL-2, but really it was its own aircraft, and the two planes had very few parts exactly in common. And it was considered a relatively low-risk proposal, as the internal structure and basic shape were based on a proven design. The IL-8 used a significantly more powerful engine, and it could carry up to 1,000 kilograms of ordnance, which was considered high for a close air support plane at the time. Early flight tests in 1943 showed promise. The new plane had better performance over the IL-2 in pretty much every area except for agility. But the new AM-42 engine ended up being a major problem. In short, the specifications and mountings that the plane was designed around changed by the time that the engine was ready, which resulted in cooling problems, excessive vibrations of the airframe, and fuel leaks. It took over a year to iron out all the problems for the third prototype, which finally flew in late 1944, but by the time the IL-8 had passed state acceptance trials, it ended up not really showing any improvement over the IL-10, which was a similar plane that had been worked on in tandem, and it was not chosen for mass production. Only 3 prototypes of the IL-8 were built. What we get in War Thunder is the IL-8 1944, a premium strike aircraft in rank 3 for the Soviet air tree with a battle rating of 3.7. Being a World War II prop aircraft, this plane doesn't have any advanced features, but it does get a UBK machine gun and a defensive gun turret. Its main armament is a pair of VYA-23 cannons and SCAS machine guns mounted in the wings firing forward. You get a few sets of ammo belts, but I'm going to make this easy for you. Pick the universal belt for the tail gunner and the SCAS machine gun. Use the universal belt for the cannons if you're going for air combat, or the armored targets belt if you want to hit ground targets. For loadouts, the IL-8 can carry up to 6 bombs of different sizes out on external hardpoints and small bomb bays inside the wing roots. One important note to keep in mind, the BRA-B series bombs, that's the ones with the blue tips, are armor-piercing bombs made for taking out pillboxes and fortifications. In 99% of circumstances, it's going to be better for you to take the regular bombs. My personal preference is the pair of Fab 500M44s, but the set of 6 Fab 100Ms can usually take out a base in realistic battles. When it comes to flight performance, the IL-8 isn't going to be a rock star. It's faster than some other ground pounders and bombers, but it's slower than most single-engined fighters it faces. Its acceleration is pretty average, and its rate of climb is also pretty average for a ground pounder. One area that stands out is agility, and the news isn't good. The IL-8 is pretty sluggish in air combat. It doesn't have good energy retention, its rate of roll isn't very good, and its turn radius is unimpressive. The plane has combat flaps, but honestly, they don't help much. You're going to want to avoid maneuvering dogfights whenever possible, but the usual disclaimer applies that the flight performance gets a little better after you drop your bomb load. It doesn't get good, but it gets better. It's also worth mentioning that the plane has a lot of rudder lag, mostly due to its weight, which can make it a bit more difficult to line up gun solutions in air combat. One high point, though, is that the IL-8 can take a lot of punishment. This is a heavy, tough plane that can still fly with most of a wing missing or heavy damage, and I found that it takes a lot of hits to bring one of these things down, either from ground fire or enemy aircraft. Taking this plane out in air battles is going to feel pretty familiar if you've ever used a mid-tier ground pounder before. The load of 6 Fab 100M bombs can usually take out a base, but otherwise its bomb load is more suited to hitting AI ground targets, especially considering that the AAA guarding the bases these days can actually be pretty dangerous. One nice feature is that the tail gunner has a surprisingly good field of fire, and I actually had really decent luck using the gunner to swat people off my 6. The IL-8 gets an air spawn in RB, but its rate of climb isn't really good enough to go bomber hunting, so you're probably just going to want to focus on ground attack at the opening stages of a match. Big shock, I know. In terms of close air support, the IL-8 does pretty well, but it's got a couple of caveats to keep in mind. The biggest issue is that the plane doesn't get an optical bomb sight of any kind. This means that all of your weapons are delivered completely blind, and you just have to guesstimate the ballistics on everything. It can be difficult to get accurate bomb drops, but really, that isn't super uncommon with mid to low tier close air support planes, so while it feels like a disadvantage objectively, it's not a disadvantage comparably, and most other strike planes have the same limitation at this rank. The cannons can occasionally pop light armored ground vehicles, but in practice, I found them more useful for scout tagging targets and doing superficial damage to force a repair cycle, while my teammates can hopefully move in on the ground. Visually, the IL-8 isn't an especially good-looking aircraft. It was really obviously built for a specific function, and it came out kinda clunky looking, but the 3D model in-game is well done, and it's far from being an eyesore to have it up on your screen. Landing this plane is easier than a lot of other props, and I didn't run into any nose-over problems on landing. You can safely drop gear and flaps a bit over 300 kilometers an hour, but just remember it's a heavy plane without a lot of low-speed agility or acceleration, so you may want to line up your approach carefully and keep an eye on that airspeed. The cockpit on this plane is very well detailed, but you have no rearward visibility at all, and flying in VR feels really cramped. I was able to land some bomb hits, but air combat was almost a non-starter with the VR headset. Below average cockpit. To close out on the IL-8 Battle Pass vehicle. This plane has a reasonable selection of bombs, it's physically tough, it gets an air spawn in RB, it's got an effective tail gunner, and it's a premium vehicle. However, it will never be a good dogfighter. It doesn't get an optical bomb sight, and its overall flight performance is pretty unimpressive. The final verdict on the IL-8 is that this ends up being a fairly average low-tier strike plane. If you want a Soviet ground pounder, here you go. If not, this might be one to sell if you grind out the Battle Pass. As always, thanks for watching.